Thank you very much, Stephen. Thanks to all of you for being here. It's always great to be at the Heritage Foundation, where we can have a lengthy, in-depth discussion of issues that are important to our nation, with an eye always toward good process, good policy outcomes, and in particular with an eye toward compliance with the Constitution. Because we understand that the process that we use to adopt our legal system, the processes that we use to change policy, matter every bit as much as the ultimate outcome. It's part of what separates us from other countries, part of what it means to abide by the rule of law, is to operate under the governing structure that we've adopted. I'm honored to be here today to talk about the new climate change deal that President Obama is pursuing, along with the dangers that it poses to the American energy sector and to U.S. national sovereignty, and along with the opportunity to discuss what Congress can and should do about it. In a few weeks, Paris will host the latest round of climate change negotiations in what's called the Conference of Parties under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, as most of you know, the objective of the UN Framework Convention is the stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. It was negotiated, signed by President Bush, and ratified by the United States Senate back in 1992. Paris will be the 21st Conference of Parties in 23 years. That's a lot of conferences. But don't get the wrong idea. Being a UN climate negotiator is not some kind of a part-time gig. No, this is serious business. At least it's business that keeps a lot of people fairly busy. There's much more to the Framework Convention than the Conference of Parties. Each year, they host countless events, countless meetings across the globe. In 2015 alone, they've had meetings in over a dozen countries, including Switzerland, Thailand, and Chile. And yet the convention has precious little to show for its interminable meetings, except for perhaps what might be one of the world's largest freestanding collections of frequent flyer miles among those who attend these meetings. Most of the negotiations, at least those that don't lapse into some sort of stalemate, produce little more than a series of lofty aspirations, proclamations, and vague principles, and promises to come to an agreement at some later date. And so they don't resolve the issues right then. They just say, okay, we'll reconvene. We will resolve the issues that we've been discussing at some point in the future, and then they adjourn and get together again. But Paris, we're told, Paris will be different. This summer, the European Union's Commissioner for Climate Action said that there is no Plan B for Paris. Now, he confidently declared, quote, "These are not just ongoing UN discussions. Paris is final," close quote. It sounds very ominous. I don't know exactly what that means, what that portends for the future, but there is a preemptive sense of finality in his statements. Now, personally, I'm skeptical that this is the last we'll hear of UN climate talks. You think bureaucratic inertia is bad in Washington, and it is. But imagine if all of our dull federal buildings in this town were replaced with the exotic destinations of all these places that host UN climate negotiations. I think that produces its own type of gridlock. I think that produces its own type of inertia. But in at least one important respect, I think Paris will be final. It will be President Obama's last best hope to fulfill that infamously lofty aspiration that he announced in connection with his 2008 campaign for the White House. I'm not talking about his pledge to usher in, as he put it, the moment when the rise of the oceans begins to slow and our planet begins to heal. No one, not even President Obama, seriously thinks Paris will produce an agreement that could have any meaningful effect on global atmospheric conditions within the next 50 years. Because accomplishing that would require a universal agreement, obligating not just one country or a few countries, but all countries to make significant economy-wide emissions cuts of a fairly drastic sort. But for the nations whose economies increasingly depend on high-emission energy sources like coal, countries like India and like China, this is not a tolerable outcome. India's prime minister spoke for much of the developing world when he said, quote, "While the developed countries should have targets for emission cuts, developing countries should work on targets of encouragement," close quote. If the goal of Paris is to reduce the concentration of greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere, targets of encouragement simply won't cut it. It's not going to happen. But of course, that's not the goal of Paris, at least not for the Obama administration. No, for President Obama, Paris, above all, is an opportunity to continue his pursuit of that other lofty ambition from 2008, his goal of fundamentally transforming the United States of America. In particular, the president hopes to produce an agreement in Paris that will, at a minimum, fundamentally transform America's energy and transportation sectors. Earlier this year, several countries that will attend the Paris talks submitted to the Conference of Parties a document outlining the contributions they intend to make to the global climate change effort. The U.S. plan pledged to reduce domestic greenhouse gas emissions across the entire U.S. economy by 26 to 28% below 2005 emissions levels. This is, to say the least, to put it really mildly, an extremely ambitious target, and one that could not be achieved without very significant regulation, bringing about very significant changes to our economy. The regulations required to achieve it would, in fact, take decades to implement, and probably a host of new international monitoring and reporting mechanisms. They would also impose hundreds of billions of dollars in costs on the American economy. But the Obama administration's plan, to its credit, is not just ambitious, it's also deeply cynical, because at its core, the plan is an attempt to enshrine in an international agreement President Obama's unilateral environmental regulatory regime, which remains deeply unpopular with the American people, and with good reason. This is the same vision that prompted President Obama several years ago to say that under this plan, energy costs will necessarily skyrocket. Now, these energy costs aren't simply ethereal. They're not out there in the abstract. They're not somebody else's burden. These are energy costs that will be borne first and foremost by America's poor and middle class, who will feel it in a very real, very personal, very significant way in their own pocketbooks when those energy prices necessarily skyrocket. Now, this has been one of the president's longstanding goals, this kind of achievement. We often forget that no one expected President Obama's first signature legislative accomplishment to be Obamacare. It was, in fact, supposed to be an energy bill establishing a national limit on emissions, a strict set of limits. In the summer of 2009, President Obama hailed the cap-and-trade legislation that he was trying to move through Congress, calling it a bold and necessary step toward strictly regulating the U.S. energy sector. The bill was certainly bold, and I will give him that. So bold, in fact, that it was essentially laughed out of the Senate. It didn't get anywhere, and it was understood at the time that it would never get anywhere. Not in that Congress, notwithstanding the fact that we had reached a sort of Democratic high water mark at that point. But was the legislation necessary to impose emissions requirements on energy producers? No, at least not according to President Obama and President Obama's Environmental Protection Agency. Shortly after the American people and their elected representatives refused to assent to a law that would have empowered unelected bureaucrats to micromanage energy producers, the EPA began reinterpreting old laws already on the books, to do precisely that. What they were unable to do through Congress, they would just go ahead and do through the administrative regulatory state. The flurry of unilateral administrative actions culminated in the president's Clean Power Plan, a stringent, costly, and unpopular set of EPA regulations that will undoubtedly face opposition of the courts and Congress and by future presidents. this is what we're facing. And it's precisely that kind of uncertainty, that sneaking suspicion that his transformation of America's environmental laws may not be permanent, that explains President Obama's strategy in Paris. When you look at the fine print of the U.S. contribution plan in connection with what's about to happen in Paris, you see that a significant proportion of the 26 to 28% emissions reductions are expected to come from existing regulations, especially from President Obama's Clean Power Plan. And now, with just 1 year left in office, he's apparently hoping that an endorsement from UN bureaucrats will give his regulators and the unprecedented expansion of executive power that they represent and that they necessarily require the credibility and the sanction that he was unable to secure when he moved his plan through the Congress. The credibility and the sanction that he was unable or unwilling to secure through the democratic process, through the normal legislative process ordained by the Constitution. But it's not just the American energy sector that could be fundamentally transformed if the president is able to produce the type of agreement that he wants to get in Paris. No, the unilateral process by which President Obama plans to commit the United States to a new climate agreement, a process designed explicitly to bypass the Senate and to avoid having to seek the Senate's advice and consent in connection with such an agreement, is another step in the fundamental transformation of the way we make international agreements. So in that respect, the impact of this will be felt beyond the energy sector and, in fact, beyond the scope of any plan that's developed in Paris. It'll be felt throughout our entire country insofar as it will affect every other international agreement, potentially, that may come into existence in the future. Pursuing a deal in Paris as an executive agreement instead of as a treaty would not only violate the plain meaning of the UN Convention, it would also defy the historical understanding of the constitutional limits that the president is subject to in connection with foreign affairs, limitations that exist to safeguard the sovereignty of the American people and their right to see to it that their government remains their government and is a government of, by, and for the people. In an excellent paper recently published by Heritage, Steve Groves, who we just heard from, examines what will likely be President Obama's strategy for avoiding Senate scrutiny of whatever deal is reached in Paris. And I highly recommend what he's written on this. It's very informative. In that paper, which again I couldn't recommend more highly, Steve pulls together media reports and statements from the White House to make a compelling case that the Obama administration will try to cobble together what they affectionately refer to as a hybrid agreement. A hybrid agreement. The hybrid is a word that everybody likes these days. I mean, people like their hybrid cars. There are lots of other hybrid things they like, and so it's a hybrid agreement. Modeled on the plan submitted by New Zealand, a hybrid agreement here would include a combination of legally binding procedural commitments and politically binding targets and timetables for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The theory is that so long as the emission reduction targets are only politically binding, the president would be under no obligation whatsoever to submit them to the Senate, under no obligation to present the agreement as a treaty to the Senate for ratification. Now, the hybrid agreement theory is a clever one, to be sure. But the problem is it flatly contradicts the understanding of the Framework Convention, which has been universally accepted since its ratification back in 1992. This distinction between either politically or legally binding emission reduction targets has never been a meaningful one in the history of this particular convention. Targets and timetables of any legal character have always been understood to require the Senate's advice and consent, such that they can't be put in place, they can't be deemed to be ratified, they can't be deemed legitimate in this country without Senate ratification. In fact, just to clarify the point, Back in 1992, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee issued a report explaining the terms on which they offered their approval of the Framework Convention. And among those terms highlighted, one of those terms highlighted this notion of the Senate's rightful role in the future operation of this particular convention. The committee clarified that a decision by the Conference of the Parties or a decision by the executive branch to adopt targets and timetables, legally binding or not, would have to be submitted to the Senate for its advice and consent. Now, at the time, there was absolutely nothing controversial about these statements. There shouldn't be anything controversial about those statements today either. Particularly in light of our Constitution, there's no reason that they should be controversial. But they weren't controversial then. The George H.W. Bush administration accepted them without dispute because they reflected the long-standing view of the Senate's distinct and rightful role in the process of making international agreements. That role is expressed in the Treaty Clause of Article 2 of the Constitution. The Treaty Clause states, quote, "The President shall have the power, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators present concur," close quote. Now, for a document that is premised on the strict separation of powers, the explicit joining of powers in the Treaty Clause stands out as somewhat unusual. It's a bit of an aberration. So for the most part, there is separation of powers within the Constitution, but in a few instances, there are powers that are shared, that overlap, and this is one of them. There's this area of overlap. But where there is overlap, that overlap and the terms of the overlap are defined by the Constitution itself. But as Alexander Hamilton explained in The Federalist, there is a peculiar propriety in sharing this particular power, the treaty power, between the Senate and the executive. For Hamilton, the treaty clause is, quote, "one of the best digested and most unexceptionable parts of the Constitution," close quote, because it is consistent with the nature of treaties and the unique attributes of the presidency and of the Senate. Treaties are little more than contracts among foreign nations, according to Hamilton, and given the nature of international affairs, they're often needed to negotiate swiftly and covertly. Treaties carry the force of law, but unlike domestic laws, they derive their force from obligations of good faith between nations. Thanks to its unique capacity for secrecy and dispatch, the executive branch is best equipped to manage these negotiations with foreign nations. That's why the primary power resides in Article 2 with the President. But only legislative consent and the kind of deliberation uniquely available in the United States Senate can grant the broad political consensus necessary to ensure that the United States lives up to the terms of its agreement, the agreement that has been ratified. Hamilton's explanation of the treaty power laid the groundwork for the traditional American understanding of the factors that distinguish treaties and other types of international agreements. Those factors include whether it has the force of law or has the potential to influence domestic law, whether its terms extend over a long period of time, and whether it requires a high degree of trust and mutual obligation to be maintained under the terms of the agreement. According to this view, there's no doubt, and there can be no legitimate doubt, that an agreement of the size, the scope, and the duration contemplated by the Obama administration in Paris deserves to be submitted to the Senate for advice and consent and for ratification. As recently as 2009, this was how everyone in Washington thought about the Senate's role in the process of making international climate change agreements. That year, ahead of the climate negotiations in Copenhagen, then Senator John Kerry said he and his colleagues were prepared to be, quote, "deeply involved in crafting a solution that the world can agree to and that the Senate can ratify," close quote. Now, that was an important statement. It was uncontroversial at the time. It was relatively unremarkable at the time. It's important now for this reason. Why? Well, because today This consensus appears quite tragically no longer to exist. When asked whether the president would seek congressional approval for a climate deal produced in Paris, White House spokesman Josh Earnest made the following statement. He said simply, "I think it's hard to take seriously some members of Congress who deny the fact that climate change exists, that they should have some opportunity to render judgment about a climate change agreement," close quote. That's actually what he said. Those are his words. In other words, he's saying, unless you share the White House view about climate change, both about the science behind it and about what we do about it, unless you share that view, you are going to be disqualified from having anything to say about it. Even if you're a United States Senator, and notwithstanding the fact that the Constitution requires Senate ratification of an agreement like that, you are disqualified if you don't agree with the White House on that. That's a tragedy. And it also means that in the span of just 6 years, what was once respect has been turned into contempt in this very context. And it's not just contempt for Congress, which I know as well as anybody has done plenty to deserve any contempt directed at Congress. I mean, after all, we're an institution that now enjoys a public approval rating of about 9%, which makes us less popular than Fidel Castro in the United States. And it makes us only slightly more popular than the influenza virus, which inexplicably is gaining on us. It's contempt more fundamentally for the democratic process and for the American people that Congress represents. And this is what I find so troubling. In other words, it's one thing to hate Congress. It's another thing to denigrate the right of the people to be represented in that Congress, the right of the people who elect individuals to represent them in the House of Representatives and, for our purposes here, in the United States Senate, who will no longer have a voice in connection with an important matter of public policy like this one, which constitutionally is supposed to be submitted to the Senate for ratification. The chief obstacle to Obama's efforts to transform America has always been the sovereignty of the American people, the fundamental right of the people to consent to their laws by choosing those who make their laws. This is exactly why Congress did not send a cap-and-trade bill to the president's desk when he so badly wanted it back in 2010. And it's likely why Senator Kerry didn't claim in 2009 that the president had the authority to single-handedly commit the United States to a new climate agreement in Copenhagen. But today, with only 1 year remaining in office in the White House, and with the smug satisfaction of someone who believes the policy of climate change is just as settled as the science supposedly is, President Obama knows that compulsion, not persuasion, is the only way to fundamentally transform a nation, at least to fundamentally transform a nation in the way that he wants to transform it, with the speed that he wants to use in that transformational process. Now, in the few minutes I have left, I'd like to raise and offer a preliminary answer to the question that's probably on everyone's mind about now. What can possibly be done to stop President Obama from unilaterally committing the United States to a new climate agreement in Paris? Well, first, I think the House and Senate should take up and pass a joint resolution expressing unequivocally the sense of Congress that an agreement of the cost and scope and legal character contemplated by the Obama administration in Paris should be submitted to the Senate for advice and consent, for ratification. The purpose of this resolution would not be to oppose the president's plans on the merits of those plans, but simply to make explicit that which has been implicit in every other previous climate change negotiation, and that which is already required under the Constitution. This is simply a procedural step. For instance, in 1997, Senator Byrd, a Democrat, and Senator Hagel, a Republican, worked together to pass a bipartisan resolution to preempt a similar climate agreement that the Clinton administration was then negotiating in Kyoto. The unstated premise of their resolution was that the Kyoto Protocol would require the Senate's advice and consent in order to go into effect in the United States. That resolution passed by a vote of 95-0 in the Senate, with the support of many, like Secretary Kerry, who are in the middle of today's debate about Paris. This proved that it's not possible to to assemble a bipartisan coalition, not to debate the merits of the president's climate change policies, although that is, in fairness, a debate that we also need to have, but to assert the right of the American people to consent to their laws and to have the appropriate procedures followed when their laws are put in place. It's time we followed Byrd and Hagel's lead. Next, the Congress needs to wield what is perhaps its most important tool, its most powerful tool, the power of the purse. We can begin by making absolutely clear to the Obama administration and, just as importantly, to the foreign governments attending the Paris negotiations, that in America, it's the Congress and not the president acting alone that writes the checks. Members of both chambers and from both political parties have not only the authority, not only the right, but I believe the constitutional obligation to assert with one voice that Congress will not send a dime of taxpayer money to the implementation of any agreement to which the Senate has not provided its advice and consent. That goes for the billions of dollars that President Obama has pledged to send to the so-called Green Climate Fund. And it goes for any other funds that the Paris Agreement would expect the United States to give to developing countries for clean energy production. Finally, we need to start thinking more broadly, beyond the Paris talks and beyond January of 2017, when we are going to be swearing in a new president, about how we can repair the institutional damage wrought by President Obama's will-to-power approach to the presidency, and how to reform the laws and also the bad habits that have facilitated the accumulation of power in the executive. Now, in fairness, this accumulation of power has been going on for a long time. It's an accumulation of power that has occurred with both Republicans and with Democrats. But it's an accumulation of power that has found a lot of acceleration over the last 7 years and during this administration. For instance, we need to reform the Clean Air Act so that no future president can claim, as President Obama has tried to do, that a law passed in the 1970s somehow provides all the statutory authority and executive needs to impose new, sweeping environmental regulations on the American economy for the rest of time. And we need to start thinking about how to address, in the long run, the profound imbalance between the executive and the Senate in the process of making international agreements, in the process of making international commitments that will bind the United States now and in the future. When the United States makes major binding international agreements, when it takes on significant commitments internationally, those agreements must always be subject to the advice and consent of the Senate. This is a basic principle that can't be restated and restated and restated over and over again enough. But we need to do more than that. We need to reapply that principle to our institutions and to our laws. We need to find new ways to reassert the prerogatives of the Senate and the process of making American commitments to foreign nations. In 2015 alone, we've seen two examples of how far the balance has tilted against the Senate: the Paris climate change negotiations and, of course, the Iran deal. Just a few months ago, in a Senate Armed Services Committee hearing, I asked Secretary Kerry why the Obama administration decided not to seek the Senate's advice and consent in connection with the Iran deal. Why, Secretary Kerry, aren't you just submitting this to us as a treaty for ratification? He told me it was because the agreement involved multiple parties. This answer was not only wrong. It was not only wrong in the sense that it flatly contradicts the statement on the State Department's own website defining the word treaty as including something that includes multi-party international agreements. But it also revealed the extent to which the executive branch has stopped thinking seriously about its constitutional limitations and requirements, about checks that have been put in place on the power wielded by America's chief executive. What all these reform ideas have in common is that they're aimed at defending and asserting the ultimate sovereignty of the American people, which means that restraining an out-of-control executive is not a partisan effort. It's neither Republican nor Democratic. It's neither liberal nor conservative. This is simply an American ideal. This is a rule of law ideal. And it's not something that can be done by Congress alone. It will require the work of institutions like the Heritage Foundation to educate the American people about the dysfunction reigning in their nation's capital and what we, as citizens of this great country, can do about it. So I'm here to invite all of you not just to join me in this effort, but to lead it. To join me and others at the Heritage Foundation, others in Washington and across this great nation who are committed to the principle that we as a country are great, not because of who we are, but because of what we do. Part of what has inspired and motivated and made possible our greatness as a nation is our profound belief that bad things happen when you allow power to be concentrated excessively in the hands of the few. It's the whole reason why we have a limited constitution, why we have a constitution that carefully checks and balances power, is to prevent this very kind of thing from happening. We have to get back on track. We've got to restore those constitutional protections. As we do so, we as a country will benefit. Thank you very much.